ultimately, hope is not a plan and hope cannot be our strategy. What that means is, in our context, is that we've been talking about the coming of Moshiach and talking about all the great things that means. What's the plan? How do we make it happen? How do we make the Moshiach actually come speedily? How do we make this actually come to be a reality instead of just something that we hope for and we can talk about in class? And today we have a good l'chaim for it. But what is it actually? How does it actually play out? And how can we do something to make it get to that point? So thank God, this is something that works well with our parsha. Our parsha is where we begin the exodus of the Jews from Egypt, in the sense that it starts to happen, there starts to be progress towards the actual exodus. Here's where there's an actual steps taking place, of course, with the 10 plagues towards the exodus of the Jewish people. And this is going to teach us how to make the Geula, make the redemption happen also in our context. So let's see. Here we have the text from our parsha. And the Torah says, God is actually telling Moshe at the very beginning of the parsha, and also I heard the moans of the children of Israel, whom the Egyptians are holding in bondage, and I remembered my covenant. God says, I heard them, I heard their call, and I remember my promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Therefore say to the children of Israel, I am the Lord, and I will take you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians, and I will save you from their labor, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great judgments. And I will take you to me as a people, and I will be a God to you. And you will know that I am the Lord your God, who has brought you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. I will bring you to the land concerning which I raised my hand to give to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, and I'll give it to you as a heritage. I am the Lord. So this is God's promise that he's going to redeem the Jewish people. He's going to take us out of this mess. He's going to punish the Egyptians ultimately and bring the Jews out of Israel, out of Egypt, and ultimately to Israel. In fact, if you pay close attention, you'll see the Torah says a number of different descriptions. God says, I will take you. That means he's going to take us out of that place of Egypt. He continues to say, I will save you. I will redeem you. And then again, I will take you to me as a people. 4 different descriptions of God saying, I'm going to solve this. I'm going to take you out of this situation and bring you to a better situation. So in that case, we have 4 ways to describe the redemption of the Jewish people from Egypt, which equals 4 cups of wine. I guess that's why we have l'chaim. 4 cups of wine at the Seder. When we celebrate the Exodus from Egypt every Pesach, every year, we have 4 cups of wine for these 4 descriptions, how God didn't just say it once, but in 4 different ways. But if you pay close attention, the Torah says in number 8 here, I will bring you to the land. That's a 5th verb, a 5th description of what God is going to do. That refers to the time of the Moshiach. In addition to the descriptions of God saying how he's going to act, take the Jews out of Egypt, bring them to Israel, he's going to bring us to Israel again in the time of the coming of the Moshiach. So from what happens here, we will be able to see the key also today. In other words, whatever happened in Egypt, how God promises a redemption, he promises we're going to solve this problem and take the Jews out. And then, of course, he actually does so. This is going to happen again with some similarities in the final redemption and the coming of Moshiach that we always hope for and we've been talking about. We get this idea from the verse from the pasuk that says in the prophets, as in the days of your exodus from Egypt, I will show you wonders. God did miracles for the Jewish people back then, and he's going to do miracles for us again. So the miracles that happened then are not only similar in the fact that we're going to have another round of miracles, but the details are similar as well. We can compare, and we can find a relationship between the things that happened then and the things that will happen very soon with God's help with the coming of Moshiach. So here we go. If we want to discuss and discover what happened at that time, what happened when the Jews left Egypt, how did the redemption take place, and then based on that we'll also see how would it happen when Moshiach comes. Well, let's see, continuing in our parsha, discussing what happened actually when the Jews were in Egypt. So of course we know there were the 10 plagues. The 10 plagues of the blood, frogs, lice, hordes of wild animals, pestilence, boil, hail, locust, darkness, slaying of the firstborn. Let's go through them in more detail. 7 of these 10 plagues are in this week's parsha. The final 3 we'll read about next week, and that also causes the end when the Jews finally do leave Egypt. So number 1 is the blood. What is it about the blood? The river, of course, turns to blood, and the Egyptians have nothing to drink. And that's the first wave of punishment and trying to threaten Pharaoh to get the Jews to go out. He doesn't listen. God promises more and brings frogs. And frogs fill the entire land, and wherever they go, and into their food, and into every single part of life, there are frogs. It's impossible to live. When the frogs are gone, again, Pharaoh says, no, I will not release the Jewish people. And then he's attacked by lice, and then by actual wild animals. Pestilence, death of the animals in their flocks. Boils on their hands and feet, and even on the animals too. Hail, which was actually a combination of fire and ice. And next week we're going to read about locusts, the grasshoppers that ate up their crops, the darkness, and slaying of the firstborn. So we have over here a lot of drama, 10 different plagues. Why should there be 10 plagues? Any suggestions?
10 commandments.
Okay, so 10 plagues for the 10 commandments. That's a good one. It actually is a parallel. There are 10 statements God made in creating the world, 10 commandments, and 10 plagues, and other numbers of 10 sefirot in Kabbalah, and etc. But couldn't God bring the Jews out of Egypt and get this done without 10 plagues? In fact, what made it work in the end? What solved the problem ultimately? So why didn't God do that first? I understand Roosevelt or Truman fighting World War II and then get rid of the Nazis and still fighting the Japanese. You don't get to the atomic bomb and to the nuclear option till A, you actually have one, which they didn't have in the beginning, and B, you have no other choice. But God, he knew the whole picture. He knew that this was all not going to work until he gets to the number 10. So if the goal is to get the Jews out, why not go straight to the goal?
It's not only for Egyptians, it's for Jews as well. So they need time to observe the God's presence, all miracles, just to get the justice to believe and to be ready to go.
Okay, so in other words, the Jewish people as well needed to have the time to process through the exile and through the adjustment to the redemption. That's a good explanation. In other words, it's be step by step, bang by bang, we get the Egyptians until the Jews themselves grow into it. Any other suggestions?
I mean, I got a question. I mean, the God was punishing not like the Pharaoh himself. He was punishing like the rest of the people who have nothing to do with Pharaoh's decision. So like slaying like a firstborns. I mean, what's the point of doing that?
Okay, so that's a good question. I'll repeat it for our online listeners in case they couldn't hear you. Why would God punish everyone? He should punish the leadership. He should punish Pharaoh. he should punish anybody who's involved. Why is he punishing the entire nation with the 10 plagues? It's interesting that the commentaries ask this question in a different form because they want to know when it comes to the plague of the firstborn, the worst one, the Torah is very specific. And the Torah says that even the firstborn prisoners also were killed. Now, if they're prisoners, they obviously were not involved. Obviously, they're not a part of this whole slavery. I mean, they may have been in prison for 30 years. They're not involved in this whole persecution of the Jewish people to begin with. So why should they suffer? The explanation is given actually that they were involved. They were involved in the sense that this was something that they appreciated. This is something that they wanted to see. This is something that they rejoiced over, seeing the suffering of the Jewish people. So in other words, the rest of the people, not only the leadership, were actively involved, and those people who wasn't even possible for them to be involved in any way, nevertheless supported it. They were behind it. They, as we say, rejoiced in it. So it's nevertheless applicable to everyone. But yes, that would be a very good question. Any other thoughts on why we have the 10 specific plagues? I'm looking for a slideshow here that's not coming up. Okay, so we'll begin with what you see here, where the Torah itself gives the explanation for why we need those plagues, why so many. Why don't we go straight to the point? Why do we make what seems to be maybe unnecessary suffering? Why don't we just get straight to it? And the Torah says, when God sends Moshe to Pharaoh to warn him about the first plague, he says, "V'lo yishma lechem Paro." Pharaoh will not listen to you. Pharaoh will not hearken to you, and I will lay my hand upon the Egyptians. And I'll take my legions, my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt with great judgments. And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I stretch forth my hand over Egypt, and I will take the children of Israel out of their midst. So there's something about knowing. God wants them to know that I am God. God doesn't just want to get the Jewish people out of Egypt. He wants to reveal something. He wants to explain something. He wants to prove something. What is that? We say that I am God. They will know that I am the Lord when I stretch forth my hand over Egypt and I take the people out. They will see who's boss when God changes the water to blood, brings the frogs, takes the frogs, brings the lice, and etc., etc. So the purpose of the plagues is not only to punish the Egyptians and not only to frighten them into freeing the Jewish people, but actually to make a point to reveal God's presence in the world. If you break that down, there are 3 times that the Torah makes this point.
But those 10 plagues, they didn't affect the Jews, though, right?
That's right.
So it's not only just to show what I can do, it's also to show that it's affecting them, but it's not affecting you. So it's kind of to tell the Jewish people that I
choose
you, you know, so make sure you understand it and respect it. So I think that was the message as well.
Absolutely. So let's zero in on that because that's part of what I wanted to get to. There's an additional miracle here that when these plagues happen, they don't affect the Jewish people. And that's why you see the Torah repeat this idea 3 times, each time a little bit differently. Firstly, the Torah just says, as you see here, they'll know that I'm the Lord when I stretch my hand and I make my point, I can do what I choose. Again, the Torah says this later on in the plagues. The Torah says, they will know that I am God, b'kerev ha'aretz, within the land. They'll know that I am active within the land among the people. What does that mean? That God is not only in the heavens, but God is actively involved to the point that he says the plague strikes here on the Egyptians and it did not strike the Jews, as you mentioned. And finally, the Torah repeats this again and says that by these plagues and by these miracles, they will know that there is none like me. And not only God exists, and not only he's present, but he's all powerful to the point that he does impossible things like making the fire and the ice combine in that kind of hail, or turning the darkness into a tangible, thick darkness that prevented the Egyptians even from moving from their place. So in sum total, you have over here three stages that correspond to three things that Pharaoh didn't believe in, which are also three mistakes that is common to make when talking about God. When Moshe first approaches Pharaoh, we read this in last week's parsha. He says, God said to release the Jewish people from Egypt. And Pharaoh says, I don't know this God. I don't recognize this God. We have our own gods. I don't accept this. So he rejects God. What does he reject? If you break that down, he rejects that there is even a God, the Jewish God, the true God that we believe in. But some people believe in God, but reject B. They say God is not active in our world. God is in the heavens. God is not involved. And therefore, they go on to say, why does God care if I eat, the meat and milk together or separate? He's not involved. He's not part of what we do in this small planet Earth, which is just a little dot in all the galaxies. Some people understand that God is involved, but they make a further mistake. Say God is the God, God is involved, but they don't recognize that in front of God, there are no limitations at all. The limitations of nature of our world begin and end in our world. God created them. And for God, they're just as good as if they weren't there. They're just as flexible as before they were created. So we never have a reason to give up hope, and we never have a reason to attach any limit to the potential of what God could do for us and overall, because God is all powerful. This is played out in the plagues, all three ideas. By God doing these things, you see the presence of God, but you also see that God is involved. He doesn't only exist. 9 out of 10 people in the United States believe in some kind of higher power. But most people don't understand that God is present, involved. But when you see that wild animals descend on Egypt and they stop right outside the Jewish neighborhood, God is paying close attention. He's local. He's involved right here. And then when God does the impossible, mixing the fire and the ice, for example, you begin to understand that there are no limitations before God at all. So the purpose of the plagues is to reveal the presence of God. The purpose of the plagues is to really show us how God is not only in existence, but active and all powerful in our world.
So, but 10, why is it 10? Maybe 9 would be enough, maybe 10 would be not enough for Jewish people to believe exactly as you explained us right now so deeply.
That's a good question. Why the number 10? This would not address the exact number 10. It only addresses why we have a whole round of plagues to begin with, to bring the message, because it's not only about the goal of getting the Jews out, but actually revealing the presence of God. Why 10 and not any other number? We could think of some other explanations. For example, mentioned earlier, we all work in the numbers of 10. God created the world with 10 statements, but those 10 statements are what's hidden because God's hand in the world is hidden. So maybe 10 plagues bring that out.
10 sphirot.
The 10 sphirot, which correspond to those 10 statements, exactly the same. We also have elsewhere in the Midrash and in the commentaries that God was using a military strategy. In other words, each step is similar to an old world military strategy. First, you cut off the water supply, then you strike fear, you make noise, which was the frogs, and you build up this military strategy all the way to the actual strike, which is the 10th plague, the firstborn. So it could be the 10 steps just informed in going through the process. That would be another way to understand it. But yes, that's a good separate question. of why specifically the number 10. So we've talked about the Exodus from Egypt, and we talk about how this is all relevant, how this is all these plagues are necessary, not only to get the Jews out of Egypt, but to reveal God's presence. This is what takes us to our time and to the Exodus with the coming of Moshiach that we hope and pray for. Because we have to look at these words. We've talked about this probably in the past. These are two Hebrew words, Golah and Geulah, which mean exile and redemption. The time that we're currently in, the time of this dispersion and suffering of the Jewish people, and then redemption, the time of Moshiach. But if you look carefully, you notice that these two words are very similar. These two words are almost exactly the same. Why? How? So here you have 4 letters, Gimel, Vav, Lamed, and Hey. You'll recognize the same 4 letters down here, plus one bigger letter that got involved. What's that one bigger letter? That's the Aleph. The difference between the word Golah, the word for exile, and the word Geulah, for redemption, is only and exclusively that Aleph. What does that all mean? So they say that, I guess Shakespeare or somebody else said that a rose, if it had another name, it would be just as beautiful and just as sweet. A name is just a name. It doesn't change the rose. You can call a rose whatever you choose. In Hebrew, you call it Shoshana. But in Hebrew, in the original biblical Hebrew, in the original, what we call the holy language, the language of God, a name means something. Every name expresses the reality and the life of whatever is called with that name. This is why the Torah specifically praises Adam, the first man, that he was able to name all the creatures. Because to give a name means to truly understand what that thing is about. So the name for exile, for the bad time, is Golah, exile. The name for the good time is Geulah, redemption. Almost exactly the same. What's the difference between them? That Aleph. So these names are going to teach us what they're all about. We just have a small problem. The problem is that our slideshow ran out because I don't have the other one, which I thought was here. Yes, it's not here. So I'm going to make everybody wait, and I'm going to get it from the other computer. Give me a moment.
And we have a time, huh?
That's great.
Yeah, break for the time.
Что говоришь, что с Америкой будет? Вольница наша. Я думаю, сейчас друг друга иголки вцепятся, когда это все поутихнет, уляжет, они между собой не разберутся, они уже начинают бодаться. Протест Пелоси там и прочее.
Байден идет, останется Камела.
Да нет, так они не демократы между собой, у них тоже есть более левые демократы, более правые демократы.
I should have known not to interrupt because we're going to get onto a different topic. That's not working, so we're going to use
No, it's actually, I think it's actually a related topic, you know, because I'm hearing what people are saying that when in the show in the morning, you know, they're all freaking out over this. I said, listen, you know, with the Jews, we're not supposed to even get involved in this stuff, you know.
Exactly. We're
Let,
gonna
let,
say
let, let go and figure it out.
Moshiach is gonna come. It's gonna be good.
Просто евреи хотят быть патриотами Америки. Все равно быть патриотами Америки. Нам надо быть патриотами евреев. По большому счету, если так проблема.
Well, sorry about that. So, what is this? What does these two things actually mean? Why do we need the two separate names of Gola and Gula, exile and redemption? The difference between them is only that Aleph. Why is that the only difference, and what does that mean? So let's first look at the two. Okay. Let's first look at the two words that we had and define each one. Gola, it's not coming up. We'll wait for it to come up. But meanwhile, Gola, the first word meaning exile, means to find that which is hidden inside of us. We talked about how in the time of exile is the time when the Jewish people go through suffering, but we find the deeper hidden thing inside of us. But Geula means that we take that Aleph and we add it into the exile. We take that Aleph and we change the situation by bringing in what's the Aleph? What's number one? Who wants to guess? One refers to what in Jewish tradition?
Only one God.
So if there's one God. That's the letter Aleph. So we have Gola, we have the exile, and by adding the letter Aleph, the presence of God, it becomes redemption. What does that mean? In a nutshell, what that means is what we just talked about. The difference between exile and redemption, the difference between the time before Moshiach comes and the time when Moshiach is actually here, is the difference between the Aleph, God's presence being revealed and God's presence not being revealed. Now, if anybody remembers, we talked about this in the summertime. It's one of my favorite good Jewish jokes. They say that as if you speak in the synagogue, if you're saying a joke, you should only say it once a year because people actually remember. If you're saying an explanation in the Torah, you could say it more often because people will forget. But we'll see if anybody remembers. Anyway, in this story, the simple Jew goes to the synagogue and he's trying to just hear some words of Torah. He never really had a Jewish education or any kind of education. He doesn't really know much, but he tries to just listen in, and whatever he can hear, that's what he knows from the Torah. So he comes home one night, just in the shtetl, back to the farmhouse, and he's all excited. And he tells his wife, you know what I heard in the synagogue today? The rabbi said, Moshiach is going to come. He's going to take us to Israel. Life is going to be good. We're going to have a temple. We're going to be in Jerusalem. We're going to be independent. This is the dream. And she's just looking at him and she's not so convinced. She doesn't maybe really think it's so exciting. Just 1 second. Our goat, we just got a new goat. You want to just leave the goat and go to Israel? What are you going to do there? No goat. And think about it. Last week, we finally, after 6 years, came to terms with our neighbor over the border of the vegetable patch. Now you want to leave the vegetable patch and go to Israel? And she goes on, and basically, life is gonna be totally different. Why would we ever want to go to Israel? So our simple Jew is thinking, says, you have a point. But I'm not worried. Because God is great. The same God who saved us from Pharaoh, the same God who saved us from Haman, the same God who saved us from Stalin, from whoever else it might be, that same God, he'll save us from the Moshiach too. Don't worry about it. We'll be okay. Of course, it's good for entertainment, but it expresses something. Because actually in 1991, obviously the Rebbe knew, as a tzaddik would know, that his time to speak to the public was limited, because by the early 1992, he had a stroke and was no longer able to speak. And he was speaking very strongly in 90, 91, 92 about the coming of Moshiach. And at one point, this is this very interesting talk, because there are some people who are very concerned, very worried. He said, we're talking about the coming of Moshiach, and everybody should do something to make the Moshiach come. And this worries them. I wanted to show you the text, how the Rebbe says this, but our slideshow's not working, so we'll skip that. I'll just try to repeat it. They're concerned, what does it mean the Moshiach is going to come? What's going to happen to all of our life here, especially in the free world, especially we've accomplished so much. And the Rebbe lists is what's going to be with our businesses, what's going to be with our connections, what's going to be with all the things we accomplished after so much hard work in life as we know it. Is it all just going to disappear and we're going to go somewhere else to a new life and to a new world? And as the Rebbe says, that these are open people, so they express their concern openly. It's bothering them. But of course, they have nothing to be worried about. Why? Because of these words. The redemption, the coming of Moshiach, never meant to leave behind the exile, the ghosts. It never meant that we strike out the Golah, the first version, the time we're in now. We abolish it and destroy it, and we start something new. How do we know? From the name. Golah, exile, and Golah are the same. The difference is only the presence of God. So it's good to have a successful business, as the Rebbe uses that example. And it's good to have connections and friends and other things that you've worked on in this world. But what happens is when the Aleph, when the presence of God is not there, then all of those good things are not as good. They get stuck. They get restricted within the limitations of the time of the Galut, the time of the exile. In other words, they're restricted by the natural human thinking, the natural way to assume what the Rebbe calls captivity to the exile, that all these things are restricted by our non-Jewish environment, restricted by the rules of nature. If I want to succeed in my business, I better not spend too much time in the synagogue. I got to get to work early. If I want to achieve, maybe I have to work on Shabbat, etc., etc. All the limitations, how people think, just naturally in the ways of this world. The coming of Moshiach brings the presence of God in. And then we look at the same things from God's point of view. We say, this business is great, but this business is a creation and gift of God. Obviously, it works best by God's rules. It works best if we do it honestly. It works best if we don't do this on Shabbos, etc., etc. So we actually do the very same things, but approach them differently because now we feel a relationship with God. What marks the world we live in today is the concealment, that God's presence is not revealed, that we don't see how God is there. And what changes in the coming of Moshiach is that we do see, and we're able to appreciate that this all is from God and actually see its connection to God. And therefore, the Rebbe concludes in that talk, there's no reason for anybody to fear the coming of Moshiach. You're not going to lose anything. On the contrary, if you're doing well in business, for example, do more. All of that is going to stay with you. But do that already today as we prepare for the coming of Moshiach. Do that in a way that appreciates and prepares for and begins this idea of God's presence being revealed there. So if you look in the Rambam in Maimonides, he starts off in his very last chapter to explain, he says, don't imagine that the coming of Moshiach will be a total dramatic change in this world, and nature will stop working the way it usually does, and we'll have some other form of life, and everything is going to be different the way people like to imagine. He says, don't raise that upon your heart. I mean, don't even consider that kind of idea. That's not how it works. And he quotes from the Talmud, the difference of this world and the coming of Moshiach is what he calls shibud malchiot, which literally means being subjugated, being subservient to a foreign kingship, not being independent as the Jewish people. But in a broader sense, that means the limitations and the restrictions that are imposed upon us, or sometimes we impose upon ourselves because of our perspective on what life is, because of the way we see reality, not because the way reality truly is, that is all the hand of God. The Alter Rebbe once said that the Moshiach that people are waiting for is never going to come. And the Moshiach that's really going to come, people don't know to appreciate. In other words, this imagination that he's going to wipe out an existing world and start something new, that's not what it's about. What it's really about, we have to learn to recognize. And that is that we recognize and we see that the real difference is that Aleph, that the presence of God will be felt. And that's what causes all the difference in our own behavior, in behavior of the people around us. Because imagine if everybody knew and appreciated God's presence, none of some of the issues we started talking about when we paused would come up. None of that would happen if everybody recognized the hand of God in everything in life. Going as a step further, none of the natural problems of this world would be there if God was revealed. The Kabbalistic reason for why there is suffering, why there is even natural suffering, the sickness, natural disasters, other limitations or shortcomings of life in this world, is because God's presence is hidden. God himself created this world. God is the essence of goodness and perfection. Everything is good and perfect. But then God hides himself, what we call the tzimtzum, we've talked about before, from being active and present in that world. So life in this world acts as if he's not there. And things don't go so perfectly. And people contract terrible diseases. Other people have other problems. When the presence of God is revealed, it changes not only the way we live, but the way the nature operates. Not in the sense that it becomes crazy, but in the sense that it works as originally intended. It works in perfection. It works in that goodness that Adam and Eve had in the Garden of Eden in the time when everything was as perfect as originally intended. So bottom line, the coming of Moshiach is that Aleph, the revelation of God's presence in our world. Almost exactly as we talked about the Exodus from Egypt. It wasn't about just finding the magic strike, trying 10 different buttons till one of them got the Egyptians to let the Jews go. But it was more about making a point, in other words, showing everyone, those in Egypt, the Jewish people themselves, and the people around, that God is the boss, revealing God's presence and control over this world. So if we're talking about the plan, as opposed to the hope for the coming of Moshiach, where does that leave us? Yes.
It's interesting. Aleph is one.
Mm-hmm.
Aleph, if you look deeper, it's just like three levels.
Has three parts.
Three parts. And it has like a lot of meanings. So just like you choose to interpret that as you wish. But you can go so many different ways.
Okay, so if you wish, we can use three meanings of the Aleph
I don't want to
that will all work onto this topic.
How come you come up with just like one? Just like maybe one, maybe not.
So let's answer this question in a Jewish way. Because the question being asked is, Aleph can mean so many things. If the evidence is the slide, if the evidence is that Golah is without the Aleph, but with the Aleph, it changes to something else. And that's how we build the whole idea that it means the revelation of God. How do we know what Aleph means? He said Aleph is number one. So Aleph means the one and only God. So the doctor asks, well, Aleph has other meanings too. How do you know which one to choose? So the way I know which one to choose is because the Rebbe taught us this idea, and it's actually taken from earlier books. But a number of other meanings that are found in the Aleph also belong in this picture. I wasn't going to get into it, but now that you mention it, it's interesting. Because Aleph, we use the number. The number for Aleph is 1. 1 in Judaism always means God, not only because we're so excited about the one and only God and no idols and all of that, but because we understand, as explained in Chassidus, that everything in this world is multiple. There's no such thing as one. If you have one table, it's not one table. There's a top, there's legs, screws, whatever components you have. You have one human being, there's a lot that's going on in there. There's nothing that's one. Everything is parts. Even you go down all the way to one particle and you're going to start breaking that down into atoms, neurons, all the different components. You can keep going and going. Nothing is one besides for God. God doesn't have any parts. God is just that one pure entity that is God. So the only true one, not only there's only one God because there's no competition, but there's only one God, that's the only true oneness. That's why one means God. But Aleph means other things besides one, that's correct. Aleph means to teach. Aleph, if you go back into the Torah, you'll see Aleph chachma, Aleph chabina, means I will teach you wisdom, I will teach you understanding. I will teach. Aleph, because Aleph means to teach. In Aramaic, it's ulfana, means learning, to study, to gain new information. So Aleph refers not only to the oneness of God, but to the study of Torah.
I can show another bowl. It's just like, okay, 1 is a God, and 2 is not God, and 3 it is not God. Why should we like limit?
So here's where I always have the debate, how far should we go? When should we return to the original topic? But 2 in Kabbalah, 2 always represents the divisiveness, the place where God's presence is not felt. 1 is the pureness of God. 3 is where God and the 2 kind of make peace and it comes together again. But 2 is a situation where you say, there's God and there's me. And maybe there is a God, but I'm independent. There's separation. It's a false illusion. It's the way humans feel about life, but it's not correct. But that's what it represents. The 2 means that state of being. So when we talk about number 1 versus number 2, 1 refers to a recognition of the pure truth of God, and there isn't really anything else. And 2 is where it starts to split. But anyway, Aleph also means to study, to teach, refers to the study of Torah. And Aleph also means, if you reorganize the letters that spell out Aleph, Lamed, Pei, it spells out Pele. Pele means wonder.
So basically the whole Hebrew alphabet is kind of like a hidden code by the way you combine the letters together.
Well, absolutely, yes.
Have a different meaning. In certain words, you think that's what the word means, but the combination of those words can have some other meaning that's like hidden code. So there is no, it's not an accidental that they're come together like this, and that's what this word is saying. Because sometimes it's a meaningless sentence, but it really has a behind meaning that we don't see necessarily.
So that's the richness in the study of the Torah, that there's always a deeper meaning.
I want to know where the donkey is.
Moshiach's donkey?
That's a 5,000-year-old donkey. Where is it sitting right now?
It's just trying to stay safe from
Where is it waiting for Moshiach?
from all the attackers to try to survive all those years. So the third meaning means wonder, because the coming of Moshiach is also associated with the greatest and deepest secrets of God, which we call the wonder being revealed. So in other words, in a simple sense, it's just Aleph means the presence of God, but you can go deeper and deeper, as you say, and that means to learn, recognize God on the deeper level, and even to achieve the wonder, which means the impossible, the beyond recognition of God, much further and deeper than what we speak about in the simple sense.
So basically, we do not separate the Aleph from 3 different things and trying to,
Well, the three different things, if you like. The top one, God. The bottom one, the Jew. Each one being like a small Yud. Yud being the name of God, Yud being a Yid, because we're picking the Jew, and the middle one being the covenant of the bond. So Aleph represents the bond of God and the Jewish people, and that doesn't disturb us at all because that's right on topic of what we're discussing. So if we return to discussing hope versus plan or strategy, we love to pray for the coming of Moshiach. We talked about it. We talked about it, I believe, last week. The need to pray and insist that we want the Moshiach to come and not to accept just the exile as it is. And that's great. And that's what we've always been hoping for. Jews in the way to the God's chambers are singing their belief in the coming of Moshiach. But what's the plan? If we're going to make a plan, the plan has to have something to do with that letter Aleph. The plan has to help us reveal and change the situation from the Gola, from the exile as is, to Gola plus Aleph, which would mean redemption. To reveal God's presence in this world. How do we do that?
by action.
Okay, which actions can we take?
Whatever we take.
Okay,
Because if you do not apply action, what is the difference between hope and plan?
so the difference in hope and plan is action, absolutely, but we need to identify which actions. So, number one, we have to take action. Number two, what action can we take? So, of course, if I ask you to guess, you'll guess we have to do mitzvahs. And we've, of course, talked about this, it's not a secret to any of us, that there are mitzvahs that we do, and the mitzvahs cause the coming of Moshiach in the sense that they bring God's presence into this world. Let's go into the mechanics of this a little bit deeper. The first thing we want to know is two statements of the Talmud. Again, we'll have to use it without the slide, but everyone is listening well, so we'll be good. Number one, schar mitzvah mitzvah. The reward for a mitzvah is a mitzvah. What does that mean? I'm doing a mitzvah, I want a payout. You tell me the reward is a mitzvah. Sorry?
You get a chance to do another mitzvah.
Okay. So the simple sense, absolutely correct.
You're trying to complete all 630.
The reward for a mitzvah is the opportunity to do another mitzvah. There's a bitter joke about this, how a fellow comes home and there's this old fish and his wife is about to throw it out. And he was a very stingy kind of person and could never help anyone and could never part with the smallest thing. And he says, don't throw that out, it's fish. It's valuable. She says, it's rotten, it's dangerous. I'll take care of it. And he takes the fish and he looks for something to do with it. And he finds a poor, hungry man. And he gives him the fish. He says, look, I did such a great mitzvah. Probably the first time in his life he fed up the poor. Desperate, the guy eats the fish and he gets sick. A couple days later, the miser, the stingy individual, hears that the poor man is sick. It's important to visit the sick. It's a mitzvah. God visited Abraham when he was sick. We visit the sick. We try to help. We try to cheer them up. So he visits the sick. He does another mitzvah. Unfortunately, the guy, he wasn't in good shape to begin with. He didn't make it. He died. The guy died. He goes to the funeral. That's a mitzvah too, to honor the dead and participate in the funeral. So he goes to the funeral. During the week, the morning, the Shiva, he visits the family to offer condolences. He finally comes home that night, tells his wife, that fish, you wanted to throw it out? I did 4 mitzvahs with that fish. So, a mitzvah, more seriously speaking, each mitzvah brings the next mitzvah. Absolutely correct. The reward for a mitzvah is another mitzvah in a positive sense, that if you do one, it inspires you to do another and also causes God to give you the opportunity to do another mitzvah. One mitzvah leads to the next. But if I ask you, Where's my reward? Reward for the mitzvah is a mitzvah. Reward for overtime, the boss is going to tell you, you can do overtime tomorrow too. When do you actually get the payout? So the Alter Rebbe explains in the Tanya, the reward for a mitzvah is a mitzvah means that the mitzvah itself contains its reward. When we do the mitzvah, we draw God's presence into this world. This is not a secret, I hope, to any of us. When we do a mitzvah, we establish a connection to God. That's because of the elevator example. And since I didn't mention it in a while, we'll refresh on it. And the elevator example means that Einstein goes into the elevator, even though he probably didn't have too many elevators in his day, but Einstein goes into the elevator, and a 4-year-old goes into the elevator right behind him. Now, there's a lack of relationship or communication between the two of them, because Einstein wants to talk about the theory of relativity, and the kid wants to talk about Legos. So they don't have any, in Hebrew we would call it safa mushutefes, they don't have any common ground, they don't have any common language. They don't have any way to connect. But Einstein is tired from the whole day of the theory of relativity, and he asks the boy to push the 5th floor. Just push the button, and the kid is so excited to push a button, and he pushes the 5th floor, and the elevator goes up. At that moment, a connection was created between them. The boy got to do something for the professor, and the professor benefited from the boy. There's a bond. When God gives us a mitzvah to do, I can promise you God does not need our help to put on the tefillin. He gets other ways of getting it done, but he gives us opportunity to do something for him that creates a bond. Otherwise, we're so distant from him, so small compared to his greatness, much more than a 4-year-old and Einstein. So the elevator example reminds us that a mitzvah creates a connection with God. Every time we do a mitzvah, we establish that connection. We bring the godly energy into this world, specifically into what we used for the mitzvah. Let's say the leather of the tefillin, the fish, if it was good fish, that we used to help another person. And actually, as we talked about not too long ago, all the components that go into creating that mitzvah and the energy that you use to do it, all of that is now connected to God by the bond of the mitzvah. All of that is a part of revealing God's presence. The more we do that, the more we reveal God in this world. So in other words, everything in this world is originally in a state of being hidden from God. We look at it, we see tables, we see machines, we see chairs, we don't see God, but he's really behind it. When we use it for a mitzvah, we reveal God there. The more we use, which means the more mitzvahs we do, the more of the world we change. The more of God's presence we reveal here. So this explains statement number 1 of the Talmud, which is that the reward for a mitzvah is a mitzvah. Not only that it is to do another mitzvah, which is also correct, but the reward for a mitzvah is the mitzvah itself. The mitzvah itself brings God's presence into this world. You have it on the spot. So, the next statement of the Talmud that we would want to get a better understanding for is where the Talmud says that for the use of God, for doing a mitzvah, you can only use that which is kosher. So imagine you want an esrog. Esrog for Sukkot can be a little expensive. Esrog has to be a kosher esrog. Now, esrog is a fruit, it's always kosher, but if it's planted not in a kosher way, or the first 3 years of a tree when it's not kosher to use, you cannot use it for a mitzvah. Imagine you want to have a Shabbat dinner, and you're going to serve nice, fresh, delicious pork. You cannot achieve the mitzvah with the pork. Why not? Not kosher is correct, but let's explain the details. When I do a mitzvah, so again, if I have a Shabbat dinner with kosher beef, which is both beef and slaughtered and certified as kosher, then that beef and the whole dinner and the whole table and all the people and everything that's involved is connected to God by doing that mitzvah. I just switched the meat and now it doesn't work. Why not? The same thing is going on. We're all celebrating Shabbat. We do the wine, we do the challah, we speak on the parsha. We're great. But the meat is just a different meat. Maybe even nobody even noticed. But it's not the same meat.
Yeah, because they thought it was a white fish.
They thought it was that fish too, exactly. But why doesn't it work? Why doesn't it connect to God in this case?
We just like ruined the recipe.
So we ruin the recipe, exactly. You need to have the right material. Because the whole mechanics of a mitzvah is that you take raw potential of this world, and by using it to serve God, you connect it to God and reveal God there. You have to be using the right raw material. That's because in Chassidus and Kabbalah, we know that the world around us where God's presence is hidden, again, the exile without the aleph, where God's presence is not there, is not all the same. There's two general parts of it. We call this klipat noga, and the three shalosh klipot atmeot, the three completely impure klippas. What's the difference between them? Klippa literally means the peel, the negativity. Like the klippa in this sense is like the peel of, let's say, a citrus fruit. You want the fruit, but you have to get through the peel first. So everything that's in this world is good, but it's trapped inside that peel, the klippa, which refers to everything that's negative.
But you can just play with klipa.
So you can change it. You can take off the peel and get the fruit. So when we do a mitzvah, we take off the peel, we take off the veneer that this physical material seems to be independent and separate from God, and we reveal God's presence in there. We reveal a connection to God. We find the fruit. But that only works for klipas noiga, for what we would call neutral. It's not actually bad. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just not revealed presence of God. Then you can take it and you connect it to God. Or you can take it and use it for something negative. It's actually in between. It can go either way. So make good choices. But the three klipos hatmeos, the three completely impure forces, you cannot take them to God. They don't have that potential. In Hebrew, we say if something is kosher, it's mutar. Literally, you translate that as permissible, allowed. If something is non-kosher, it's asur. It's forbidden. Forbidden means you can't have it. But the word asur in Hebrew means tied down. A prisoner is called the asir. He's locked, he's tied. Because everything, the kosher, neutral things in this world are not tied down. They're not up to God yet, but they're not tied down. You can take them up to God. The non-kosher is tied down. It doesn't have that opportunity to come up to God. So bottom line, if you want to cause the Moshiach to come, you have to do mitzvahs. Why mitzvahs? Because doing a mitzvah brings the connection of that physical material to God. It reveals God's presence. But you have to do the mitzvah according to the rules. You have to do the mitzvah with the right materials that actually have potential to connect to God and not be stuck down here. Any questions so far?
Sure.
Okay.
We have 613 mitzvahs. We have 248 prohibited.
No, exactly actions.
365 cases.
Prohibited.
300 are prohibited and
Out
200.
of those 365 cases, we have passive, we have active. I can sit in the sukkah, do nothing, do mitzvah.
And it'd be easy mitzvah, yeah.
Right, and I can do, are all those things equal? You just like, what is the value?
You were working all day today?
I was working very hard.
Because you're ahead of the game. You're like sharp, like fresh. It must be the l'chaim.
That's why
Because-
I came early, because I did not have time to go home.
Because that's exactly what I want to get to. Once we get everyone's questions is, are there some mitzvahs that work better than others? Which ones should we choose? Which ones could actually get us closer to the finish line? But any other questions so far before we move on to that?
Okay, we are doing the mitzvahs
either one mitzvah, three, four, five, whatever. And many of us, many Jews supposed to do this. But how this summation of these mitzvahs, how they can help us to bring Moshiach here. There should be some
Okay, so there's a missing link. Very, very important point. There's a missing link. We're doing mitzvahs for thousands of years. Where does the change happen? At what point? If it's supposed to lead in that direction, so what happens next?
The majority is going to win.
So that's correct. But in Chassidus it's explained, and we've talked about this, that the mitzvahs are transforming the physical to reveal God's presence. But on the other hand, that takes place beneath the surface. Because we all know that the Torah scroll in there is holy. Because it's a Torah scroll. But if you ask somebody else, he might tell you it's just parchment, it's just a scroll, nothing, no big deal. You don't actually see, it doesn't actually look and feel holy. It's just a scroll. You don't see and feel and tangibly recognize that holiness. So what did we achieve? So Chassidus explains that this is all there beneath the surface, and when it reaches the total that God intended, then it all comes forward. In other words, the example given, that I once put up a slide of a locked chest. And that's where there's a treasure chest, but it's locked. So if a person is a rich man, as the fourth Rebbe explains, he's a rich man. Even if the treasure chest is locked, or the treasure chest is in the safe, and he is in Honolulu, he's still a rich man. He owns that. But it needs to be opened up and used. So when we do the mitzvahs, we change spiritually the physical things that we use, but at only at a certain point where the bond matures, where the chest is full, and then God opens it and it actually comes forth. So that change, that's the moment of the coming of Moshiach, when it actually comes from that potential to a reality that we can see. So yes, we didn't yet talk about that defining point, that change over from collecting a lot of potential to actually starting to use it.
But the Jewish soul keeps coming back in different bodies to complete the 613 mitzvahs, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in which body will it come back, or all these bodies will come back and it's just the soul is going to divide in many different souls?
That's the short answer, yes.
So it will,
So
all the bodies will come, all the bodies used will come from that, and the soul will be divided and fulfill those bodies. Is that how it's going to be?
So that's why a soul is compared to a candle. Because if you ever have a candle, a flame, and you need another flame, there's no problem. You just keep lighting them, and the flame doesn't get any smaller. Because the soul can always expand in that way. But specifically in the details, the 613 mitzvahs we talked about is also 613 human parts of the human body, and also 613 parts of the soul. And the reason the soul needs to keep coming back, because the soul needs all 613. You've got to have the vitamins for every part of the system. You can't have only
But
some.
some of these mitzvahs we cannot fulfill right now because we're not in Israel and because there's
Fine, so some of those were done when the soul was here. And if not, then there's some solutions. We do them when Moshiach comes, and we do them by the study of Torah. But regardless of those specifics, each soul needs all those 613. The reason it's coming back is to catch the ones that it missed. So each body owns a certain number of those mitzvahs. When the body was alive in 15th century, with this soul, it did 50 mitzvahs, let's say. Those 50 mitzvahs, that part of the soul, that energy belongs to that body. So when it comes back, it's for that body. The other mitzvahs were accomplished at a different time, and they gave energy to the
Are
soul.
those bodies supposed to meet each other afterwards, or can I know who they are? Or
That I don't know. But there is some Kabbalistic talk, if you will, and maybe this is more for our next course for Journey of the Soul. But there is some Kabbalistic talk about there's only 600,000 souls, and all of the souls are just branching out from there. So if my soul and your soul come from the same one of the 600,000, maybe we'll be friends or neighbors, or we'll have some connection.
My daughter asked me today, actually, she says that if we do everything right, believe in one God, when we come back, we're still gonna be like a family, or we're gonna know you know, we're gonna be together, or it's just everybody.
So that's another element of it. But yes, in the coming of Moshiach, when the dead come back to life, the family connections remain.
So how about those, I'm sorry, go ahead. Yeah, how about those souls who were just like one-time souls, who was visiting?
It's a very rare,
I know,
and it's usually a tzaddik.
right, did they complete all 613 mitzvahs? Or they were just given the power of?
I'm not equipped to answer that, but I will assume that those rare situations are a unique tzaddik with a certain objective. God gave it, and once that's done, that's fine.
And what happens to that soul, who fulfills his 613 mitzvahs?
Maybe that happens when Moshiach comes. Maybe that happens through a family member. We know, for example.
There is not five, because when you're in heaven, there's different levels of how you stay to God.
They don't have body anymore, right? They're just a soul.
Right, but for example, women have different mitzvahs than men. So when a woman lives as a woman, she misses certain mitzvahs. What happens then? Actually, it's fulfilled for her by her spouse, by her husband, and vice versa. So it's possible to the mitzvah to be covered in other ways, not 100% directly. Also, not every person will be a king. No matter how many times all the souls come back, there's not enough time for everyone to be a king. And there's at least 3 mitzvahs for a Jewish king. But a king represents everybody. He's only a king. That goes back to the conversation before, but he's only a king because he represents all the people, not with election fraud. So he represents everybody. And if he represents everybody, he's doing it for us too. But those are already exceptions. In any case, I promise that we're going to get to specific mitzvahs that are like the wild card, that are more powerful to actually bring Moshiach. Because we have 613.
616 mitzvahs then?
No, it's within the 613. That's the problem.
Okay,
So we don't get a chance because, I mean, a couple dozen kings, that's all you get through the history. So, first mitzvah is a famous one. It's discussed in the Talmud. The Talmud says in Baba Basra that the mitzvah of charity of tzedakah is great because, why is it great? A lot of different explanations you could give, but great because it causes Moshiach to come faster. Why does tzedakah cause Moshiach to come faster? So the Alter Rebbe explains in the same chapter in the Tanya that we were talking about earlier, that tzedakah has a mega effect. If I put tefillin, so putting tefillin takes a certain amount of time, energy, and space. All of that becomes part of the mitzvah, but it's gonna be limited in scope.
Oh, that's the mitzvah that affects you. When you give tzedakah, you affect those who will be affected by that money that will be spent, whether it's in the shul or.
So it's a broader reach.
You can feed people, whatever. Plus, that gives you an opportunity to redeem some of your sins and clean out certain things that are kind of hanging behind you.
So that's correct. And to included that though, the energy you invest in tzedakah cannot be found in any other mitzvah because tzedakah is cash, in other words. In other words, it's financial expense, whichever form it's going to be. You have to earn that money. To earn that money, you have to work and work hard. And sometimes for years, and sometimes it's a lot of, all of that becomes part of the mitzvah. So the opportunity to elevate part of the physical world in the mitzvah is so much greater. So if I drink lemon seltzer,
It's one can, it's not so much. I mean, we'll also have to talk about how the can got here. All of that is part of the mitzvah, but ultimately it's a more limited scope. But for $1 given to charity, that elevates my whole career. I wouldn't have $1, even though I could get it from somewhere else, but ultimately I have it because of this career path that I took. So even if I only give a portion of what I make to charity, which is the way it's supposed to be done, not everything, I give that percentage. For example, the 10% of the Torah says, that brings that all of my work leads in that direction. So the greatest investment in a person's life, years of school and years of building up to get to whatever point, all becomes part of a mitzvah because he gave a portion of that to charity. So the opportunity to connect the physical world to God, to bring the Aleph in, is so much greater in charity than in any other mitzvah.
The best part we were discussing the mitzvah of Milah, great Milah,
Okay.
that it's just like a bigger than the whole Torah.
So that's another one of the mitzvahs. Yes, that's another special one. If we're looking for special mitzvahs for the coming of Moshiach, so the mitzvah of a bris
The
milah,
second time came up.
of circumcision,
Right, like a special discussion right in the Torah, in the words of the Torah.
right when Moses is trying to take the Jews out of Egypt,
Yeah,
he needs to do the bris.
Right.
But I'll tell you something more. The Jews wanted to go into Israel the first time
He was almost killed
because he missed, because he delayed.
he like had hesitation.
So when the Jews are going to go to Israel the first time, most of the Jews, some tzaddikim were different, but most of the Jews in the desert, they were afraid to do a bris because they were traveling. They were afraid.
Why didn't they get the grease on the 8th day? Because I thought Jacob and his sons, they all had grease. Why weren't they circumcising their children?
So, in Egypt,
They did it.
in the desert, they didn't.
While they were traveling.
While they were traveling, they were afraid to do it. Before they went into Israel, they all had to get circumcised in order to be part of it. So that teaches us that the coming of Moshiach, also everybody should be getting a bris. Sunday there's a bris. I don't know how old he is, but I guess he's in his 50s.
This Sunday?
This Sunday. So we're on track for Moshiach to come. That's another one. Another great mitzvah that causes the coming of Moshiach to be sooner is the study of Torah. We mentioned Aleph, meaning Alephcha, meaning to teach and to study. The study of the Torah brings the coming of Moshiach sooner. Interestingly, in early 90s, the Rebbe said studying the Torah brings the coming of Moshiach, and specifically studying the Torah about Moshiach, as we're doing right now, makes that happen sooner. And that's because everything we study in Torah has a real world impact. We don't always appreciate that. But when we study about something in the Torah, because Torah has this spiritual energy, changes the world we live in. So every topic we choose to study has an impact on the world around us. When we study about Moshiach, we actually impact that within our world. Another mitzvah with a strong, unique capability to bring Moshiach closer is Avas Yisrael, love of your fellow man, love of your fellow Jew. Why is that? Because we're taught that the second temple was destroyed and the Romans took over because of the sins of the Jewish people, specifically because of the sin of fighting and infighting among the Jewish people. The Talmud tells the whole story, how originally two Jews couldn't get along and caused the Roman invasion. And more specifically, we know that in Jerusalem, in the last revolt, there was a lot of infighting in the different parties among the Jewish people. Historically, we know that caused the destruction. So how do we correct that? How do we bring the coming of Moshiach? To change that, we have to show love and connection to a fellow Jew and reverse that infighting. Specifically, it's described as the destruction coming about from sinas chinam, from hatred that had no cause. Free hatred is called, for no reason, not unjustified. So if we want to reverse that, we have to show love even when it's not deserved, even when it's not justified. There isn't a reason the other Jew that I'm going to help, that I'm going to love, maybe he doesn't deserve it, but we do it anyway. This is the way the Rebbe taught, to help every Jew, even in prison, like Rabbi Shimon does. Every Jew we reach out to and we show kindness to, even if they're not good people, they don't deserve it, because we're doing this for free. We're doing free love instead of the free hate. These are some examples of specific mitzvahs that can bring the coming of Moshiach sooner. But again, it's really in the potential of each and every mitzvah. Before we go into the closing video, I have to ask Mark if he has any questions. Mark, do you hear me?
Yeah, I hear you fine.
Any questions? I've been taking everyone else's.
No, I'm good. I'm good.
All right. Well, then we'll need to go back online.
Lawrence is up, okay, Mark.
Those are your choices. Don't miss the rest of the mitzvahs, especially the challah, because they're waiting for it. I'm just using an example of any mitzvah. So here we'll show a short video clip of the Rebbe making this point about doing a mitzvah to no one other than the CNN reporter. They were a little better respected at that time.
Rabbi, can you tell us the message you have for the world about Moshiach, the message you have for the whole world about the Moshiach?
She was printed in all the press of all the countries. The Moshiach is ready to come now. It is only from our part to do something additional in the realm of goodness and kindness.
So people should be doing goodness and kindness for him to come.
At least for more than Moshiach will come immediately. That's what gives to charity, the double portion of charity.
Thank you, Rabbi. You're very kind. Thank you, Rabbi.
Double portion of kindness.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Double portion. Double portion.
Ja, mijn moeder is heeft een stuk meer van Moshiach jetzt.
Amen. Dan van Moshiach. The series says, Amen. Dat van Moshiach. Dan mag zeggen Moshiach zal komen sneller.
So, as you may have noticed, if you paid close attention, the Rebbe didn't just say to do acts of goodness and kindness and charity and mitzvahs, but the Rebbe actually made that point, giving the dollar for charity and the extra dollar to every member of the camera crew. That's maybe a good example for the free kindness. They deserve it, they don't deserve it, doesn't matter. They're going to be a part of it too, and they show them the love too. That's the way we change the hatred to love, and we bring about the coming of Moshiach. That's our class for tonight.
Thank you.
And we're ready for more next Monday night. I hope everybody will be here.
Thank you, Rabbi.